And one of the things that we wanted to let you know before the session starts is that this meeting will be recorded, but also feel free, if you want to not appear on the camera, you can also turn off the camera. It's something that in the end it's optional. So I hope that in the end everyone can already have a nice time to share everything that you would like to share regarding this topic, or regarding what you're working on your own respective works or jobs. So yes, as I was saying, this was a project that we started with Gabriela, also from Glitch, and that in the end, Julia is the one who's also like taking the lead nowadays from this side. So Julia is the head of policy and research and campaigns at Glitch, and myself, I'm Oyidia, and I'm a policy and advocacy advisor for digital rights at ENAR, the European Network Against Racism. I can remove this. I will try also to make sure if I can remove the bar. Yeah. So before we get started, I just wanted to let you know like a couple of rules that I think it would be interesting to also share with you. So for example, make sure that your microphones are muted, and just use them if you want to speak. As I was saying before, make sure that the camera, you can already decide if you want to have your camera on or off, which is a personal choice in the end. And please do not record the session or take screenshots that identify others. In the end, after some days, we will be sending a link with the whole session. So I think that it is not needed to in the end to take our own notes regarding this. Also, use the raise hand feature if you feel like you want to ask any question, or use the chat box instead. And be mindful of the space that you're taking up, especially with the topic that we want to talk about today. Also, I wanted to make sure that the content that we are going to expose today, or that we are going to talk about today, have topics that maybe for several people could be upsetting, or so please look after yourself and message us. You can message the people from Glitch or the people from ENAR in case you feel that you need further support during or even after the session. So it's something that we will be waiting like maybe 5-10 minutes after the session finishes, in case somebody needs any kind of assistance or needs to speak about anything that we discussed during the meeting. But after the session, it's also okay. Okay. So I wanted to start with an icebreaker before Julia was saying just to write down on the chat box, if you could write your name, your organization, and location, which is something that most of you did. And I don't know if all of you shared already your job role, but one question that I would like to have answers, and to just for my curiosity, learn from all of you. What is the piece of technology from the past that you would like to see back on trend, like now in 2023? I think it's something nice, and that in the end, who knows if more some of you already have like the same vision, the same kind of gadget that you would like to bring back. So feel free to add these questions on the chat. So I think that we can start already with presenting a little bit the session. I give the floor again to Julia, so that she can already start with the presentation. Yeah. So Julia, do you want to present the speakers, or I don't know if you hear me?
Yes, I do. Sorry, I got distracted reading everyone's technology that I would like to see back.
Okay,
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. So I'm, as Ayodhya said, I'm Julia Slupska. I'm the head of policy research and campaigns at Glitch. And so the three speakers today will be Ayodhya, you've already heard of, who's policy and advocacy advisor at ENAR, talking about introducing the concept of AI harms and what AI harms look like, especially for racialized communities. And then we're going to hear more from Mutale Nikonde, who's the CEO and founder of AI for the People, presenting some case studies of AI racism and discrimination. And lastly, I will be speaking on behalf of Glitch, talking a little bit about the landscape on redress for AI and digital harm. So this session, this first part of the session, we're thinking about 45 minutes total. And so after each of the speakers present some of these ideas, we'd love to hear from you and we'd love to hear your questions. And after that, we will transition out into breakout groups, which will not be recorded. So if you would like to speak, but you would prefer to not be recorded, please maybe save those discussion points for the breakout groups. But if you're happy to speak and be recorded, then please either raise your hand or put something in the chat and we'll kind of loop you into the discussion, especially if anything's unclear. So I'll hand back to Ayodhya for your presentation.
Yeah. Thanks, Julia, for presenting and putting a little bit of light on how much the time that we will be spending today speaking about this topic. So in my case, I wanted to speak a little bit about AI harms and what they are. And from there, yeah, we can continue with Mutale and Julia's part. So in this case, I wanted to speak about AI harm just to understand or to also be all of us in the same page or more or less. And from there, we can also have different points of view or even try to speak a little bit more about this. So this is something in order to find out what is AI harm. I based this what I'm going to talk today on a paper which is called Privacy Research with Marginalized Groups, what we know, what's needed, and what's next. It was a paper that for me was really, I just read it, I just found it and I thought that it was really interesting. And because I found, without thinking that I would find something about AI harms, I found a lot of information, specifically related to data privacy, which is something that in the end is linked when we are speaking about platforms or the use that people, marginalized communities use platforms, and specifically today speaking about racialized people. So this paper was created or written by Shruti Sanon and Andrea Forte. And in the end, it was like a kind of analysis to understand how the idea of data privacy for marginalized communities was framed across different events that they were being presented between 2010 and 2020. And in the end, I found that it was super interesting just understanding that, for example, for the framing of if we are speaking about racialized communities, racialized communities have a unique and privacy related needs that they come already from an offline setting. And then as this requires a specific needs and behaviors that we need to really have to take into account when we are trying to design platforms or spaces in which racialized communities start to work with, or just socialize also. So in many cases, we have to take into account that they have to navigate complicated decisions around their identity in many cases, and how their identity can flow from one time or another. Also because, in the end, you start with one identity, and when you try to discover and you try to understand a little bit more your roots, for example, your identity for sure might flow. And also that affects in a certain way the relationship that we have with technology. So also we have to acknowledge that the people who are vulnerable or that have already in the past a vulnerable experience are more affected by the harms when their data privacy, for example, is violated. So in this case, what we would need, it is more an equitable and data protective technology that in the end tries to repair this harm that already, even if it was, even if they had it from the offline world, and they are trying to be in another space in which they are trying to be themselves, it would be nice to have this kind of environment. So in the end, we have to take into account that racialized communities have different abilities, characteristics, and needs and values that in the end, technology should be also able to embrace in order to make sure that their identities are really matched and that the harms that they have already from their own experiences on the outside of any kind of platform, any kind of digital platform or technology can be also be repaired on the online an online setting. So from here, I think that it would be important also to explore several questions regarding, for example, the data privacy. So, for example, how we can integrate, for example, vulnerability and their marginalization for example, in data privacy strategies. How can this be done, and how we can think and speak even about this, because it's something that when we speak about data privacy, in many cases, we just generalize and we try to bring just one recipe for everyone, when in the end the needs and the needs of the users are completely different from one person to another, specifically because also the reasons why people engage with certain kind of digital platforms are completely different. Another question that would be nice also to explore is to understand how the violations, for example, of their privacy can be particularly concerning for example, for racialized communities, and how this can, how, for example, the digital divide also can impact more broadly these kind of communities. So in the end, I think that it would be nice to also take into account that in the end, it's not only the exclusion that people can suffer from a technological way or technological mode, but also from a societal exclusion. Also because in many cases, the technology that has been designed, it doesn't take into account the needs of all the potential users, because I guess that when we are trying to design something, we are thinking that our users will be A, but in the end, it's not only A, it's A, B, C, D. So how can we meet all the expectations that all kind of users have when they are using our platform in a way that, for example, their data privacy is already met? I mean, their expectations are met. So in different ways, the labor that people have to apply when they are, for example, using a platform is completely different. So, and when I'm speaking about labor, it's more about the behaviors or the steps that they have to take into account or that they have to do in order to keep their privacy safe and in order to feel safe and continue using those platforms. So, for example, it can happen that there's people who don't do anything. I mean, they are using the platform and they don't do anything, and they continue being exposed to disproportionate harms, for example. And for example, there are others who might decide to say, okay, there's this platform, I'm not going to use it. But at the same time, the absence of this kind of people, for example, of racialized people or any kind of other marginalized community, exacerbates the exclusion of these people. So we don't have information about them. There's no way in which we can develop better technology or better platforms if these people are opting out. They are saying we prefer not to stay here. So how can we make sure that this can also be removed? Also, there are others in which they just, for example, they control the kind of information that they share with others, just to make sure to protect themselves and make sure that they can still continue working on this platform, socializing on this platform, or just disclosing themselves as they are. In the end, for example, there's even people who just lie about their identities just to make sure that they can still be there and they can still be part of that community. But at the same time, the labor that implies by lying is that you always have to remember the kind of lies you already built so that you can continue there. And in order to not be caught by any other lies or any other stories that you created at a parallel level to continue on those platforms. And also, for example, any other kind of physical workarounds that people can use, for example, by removing their cameras or using headphones that people cannot hear, or what kind of content, for example, they are consuming. It is something that in the end, it's also like a kind of labor that has to be taken into account. And also, for sure, for example, creating, for example, or making sure that there might be people also who are creating collaborative spaces or collaborative spaces regarding privacy, so that in the end there's a group of people who create like a kind of setting up in which they already know how to, I don't know, create an account, a profile that's exactly the same, so that they know already which kind of answer they have to provide to the platform, for example, so that the answers or the other people are just okay with them and they are not harming them. So these are many of the practices that we see that there's people doing across the globe, just to make sure that they are not harmed, and that, for example, sometimes we see that even they are giving their accounts to third party people, for example, in which there's a risk of so they do it just basically because it is safer for them to give the account to someone who has like more experience on that platform, for example, and but that, for example, can lead into, I don't know, you're giving your personal information to another one, and this can what can happen is that the information can be also leaked by this person that you are trusting. So in many cases, there's people who have to bring a lot of trust to those platforms, and even with the people who are trying to disclose certain kind of topics, but also with the people with whom they are trying to find help or support to continue on those platforms, or to even create their profiles. So in the end, and to finalize with what I want to speak about the AI harms, there's people who have to work with different trade-offs as users, just because they come from a marginalized community. So, for example, they have this trade-off of, for example, should I look for my privacy, or on the other hand, should I disclose my identity? So should I be myself, just taking into account that this may be a risk online, because there's people who, if they see, for example, my profile, they can attack me, for example. Or, for example, another trade-off that can happen is that should I take care of my privacy, or should I provide information, risking taking into account that there might be a risk on disclosing my vulnerabilities to everyone, or to the people who I want to speak to, or that I want to interact with, or that I'm simply sharing the space with. And also, like, privacy versus autonomy, like how others can, for example, understand, how others, for example, can survey my profile. For example, if I'm asking for help to create a profile. So when for example, I just ask a third-party person to create it, how do I make sure that the information is kept between me and this person, and it is not spread across other platforms, or even in that platform? How I know that I can build that trust with this person, and that this trust would be forever, or for a certain kind of amount of time. And another one, which is the trade-off between your individual behaviors and your collective behaviors. So in a way that my privacy concerns might be only private, I mean, might not be only individual, might represent also the behaviors of a collective of people who look like me, for example, and how I interact inside of a platform, how this can be also the same for others. So how can be my behavior generalized in the end? So in this case, also for this case, in the end, people's privacy preferences may also be socially negotiated rather than purely my own decision. So how, as a group, I decide to be in one platform instead of myself saying, okay, I'm just being here because I feel safe. Sometimes we use platforms because if you know that there's people who look like you or who have the same kind of preferences are there, that therefore might be a place where I can feel safe. And with this, I finish my exposition and I give the floor back to you, Julia.
Thank you so much. I'm going to pass on to Mutale to talk about some more case studies of AI harms and discrimination.
Hi, everybody. I hope that you're well. I am going to attempt to share my screen, and I promise you I do know how to use Zoom, but not really. After 12 years on Zoom, it feels like. Okay. So I'm going to speak for about 10 minutes. I'm going to be hopefully quick and engaging. And it's based on the work that AI for the People is grounded on, which is the organization that I lead. But also kind of very interested in how this is viewed in Europe, because we are a US-based organization. So in way of our roadmap, I'm going to do a quick introduction of me, go into shock, AI has dangers. I'm going to give 2 case studies, one looking from the future of work and the other looking at facial recognition, and speak specifically to the ways that racialized harms of AI show up in those spaces, and then going to leave the discussion with a potential framework that we can start to think about how race and AI show up and potential solutions to that. So just on me, I started my organization after publishing a paper called Advancing Racial Literacy in Tech. This is the framework I'm going to discuss at the end, but it was work that started out in New York, and then I finished through a fellowship at Harvard, and it just introduced some new thinking around the ways in which we were thinking about AI back in 2019, which was it was going to save the world and we were all going to be in robots, then it was just going to be great. As I said, that led to the organization, and it has actually led to a lot of industry recognition. So as well as the work that we do in civil society and the work that we do in government, we also work with companies and came to the attention of NASDAQ and have been helping TikTok along with Shay, who leads Glitch, think about content moderation, their content moderation policies, as well as a Google case study that I will speak about very briefly, but just to give you an idea of the scope of our work. So we've been doing this work. I have been doing this work as an individual for close to 10 years, but it was very frustrating for many of us in civil society that have been looking at racialized harms of AI for at least 5 when the world woke up on May 1st, 2023. So that is, yes, about 6 months ago, the world caught on to what we knew. And that was that AI systems are not neutral. AI systems are created by people. They draw on data sets that look into historical information, and part of the historical information that they bring forward is that of histories of racist policy making that mean if you're looking at a housing data set, Black people are going to have the worst housing stock. If you're looking at an educational data set, Black people are going to perform in the worst categories, and on and on. And it's those norms of society that then go into some of the systems that I'm going to discuss. So in the United States, where I live, news has been dominated by both the writers' strike and the actors' strike. And what's been really interesting about that is that it's also brought up The different ways in which AI systems are going to change the way that we work. I'm going to repeat that. AI is definitely going to change the way that you work. It may not take your job, but that changing of work or job vulnerability is not equally met. In 2021, McKinsey did a report on the state of the Black workforce in the United States. And what they found were 50% of workers sit outside of high growth areas, which means that jobs that are easily automated are going to be in areas of the country geographically where Black people sit. So that's a very immediate way that we can think about racialized harm of AI when we think about where the jobs are going to be created in most economies are going to be in academic centers, they're going to be in commercial centers, and in those two places, that's also the place where Black populations are being gentrified from. So in this context, if we think about a place like London and the people that used to live in places like Brixton, they are not going to be close to where commerce is. And that gives us an insight to how an AI harm can really, I like to describe it as holding hands with an existing arm and then create these new realities based on AI economies that don't work for these populations. The other thing that we've been looking at in the States now for certainly the decade I've worked in this field is who actually gets to build and work on the systems. Meta is just one of many companies. Many of my talks, I talk about Meta, but really I could be talking about any company where you're seeing the recruitment of Black workers, and this is a figure, if I was looking at Black women, which would be even worse, who are thinking about the development of these systems and therefore thinking about ways in which they can be rights respecting as well as fair. We are not represented at those tables. So in the American context, we're speaking about a 1.5% technical workforce. So those are people building the systems. And then I am a social scientist. So if we think about those of us that are thinking about how systems impact society, who are also part of product teams, we're not even represented in that figure. So as we think about case studies, I want us to, first of all, think about future of work as being a key area where we should be thinking about this, because this is going to impact the material conditions of those groups, as well as thinking about some of the deployment, the ways in which AI systems are deployed, which is the next slide I'm coming to. So way back in the day, and by that I mean prior to May 1st, when people really did not understand what we were talking about or why we were complaining about racism and AI, one of the strategies that we used in order to advocate was media. And I'm going to show a very quick trailer of a short film we made with Amnesty International about a couple of years ago to speak about facial recognition, and then go into how that fits into this case study.
I was looking out of my bedroom windows, and there was officers in my patio area. One was holding his holster like this, and the other had a long gun. That escalated it quite a bit.
Surveillance has always been a thing, particularly within Black and Brown communities. All you're seeing is a nuanced tool on an age-old problem.
It does not make me feel safe for my son. I don't want his biometric data in some system from when he was 4 years old.
Facial recognition is so new that there's not enough research or laws behind how this is implemented. And until then, we should limit our usage because it can be damning.
And so this was part of a global campaign. And what we were really trying to do was to bring out and popularize research that had been done by Joy Bilawami, who was at the time at MIT, and Timnit Gebru, who at the time was a Google research scientist. And they did a paper that they published in 2021 called Gender Shades. And what they found in that paper were facial recognition systems had an almost 60% error rate on people with dark skin, as compared to identification of white men. So those would be men with a European phenotype, which was almost close to 100%. And the issue wasn't the men, the issue wasn't the women, the issue wasn't even the engineers. The issue in this particular case is what I alluded to earlier, that the underlying training data sets were using information that was already in the lab. And the people in the lab, as I said in my previous slide, are likely to not be Black. We're only 1.5% of technical teams, and then more likely to be men. So they were just literally using pictures of themselves, taking pictures of themselves, buying commercial data sets that looked very similar. And as a result, training a machine that was supposed to see to only literally see white men as human. That is up to debate. That may be something that people believe or don't believe. I can certainly fight you later if that's you. But the reason that is such a dangerous case study is that the first integration in the United States was into security systems, so into police cameras, which now are charged with identifying suspects, but they potentially are misidentifying suspects, and we're up to 8 cases of that we know of in the United States. They're actually also used. I am home. I'm in the United Kingdom for a couple of weeks, and everybody is using self-checkout at the supermarket. What they're not realizing is that they're also engaging in their faces being fed into data sets, because I am looking at the cameras taking pictures. So people, if you do not want your face to end up in a data set, just go to the till and go to the lady and say hi, and she is not selling your face to the police. And as well as self-driving cars. So as we flip to electric, we're using the same technology in electronic vehicles to identify who's on the road. It would be horrible if a Black child were not identified as a person. Therefore, stopping function, if you're an auto drive, may be inhibited, and on and on and on. So it's this idea that facial recognition may not seem dangerous to some when it's being sold to the police, but as it's adopted across the economy, it suddenly becomes a problem for all of us. The advocacy roadmap for this particular film was in 2 parts. We took this film to US Congress, where we were using it to educate Congress members, and ended up introducing the No Biometric Barriers to Facing Act and No Biometric Barriers to Housing Act, because there was a proposal on the floor that instead of keys, we would all use our faces to get into our buildings, and we wanted to intervene on that, as well as a project that we worked on with Google developers, which was looking at developing a mobile phone that creates better picture quality for Black skin. So that's actually quite a happy case study. The phone is now on the market, at least in the US, and it's doing great work. But I want to leave with you, in terms of these case studies, 2 very different examples of how racialized harm in AI become very real problems. In both cases, not just for Black communities, even though that's who I've focused on, but for all communities, because misidentification is misidentification. And in the case of facial recognition, it was the lack of identification of dark skin. So that is people who are also in Southern Europe, and then darker from there, who may not be considered Black. So in both of those cases, I've definitely laid out the problems. And in the next slide, I want to offer some ways that we can think about these problems and some frameworks that we can all take forward to take action on this. So as I said at the beginning, and as I'm finishing up, one of the things that myself, my colleague Jessie Daniels, who's a digital sociologist here here in New York, I'm in the UK, but I'm used to saying here in New York, as well as Dark Shin Mayer, who's a computer scientist, started to think about ways of how can we educate people and how can we create interventions for people to see the racialized harm of AI systems. And we came up with this framework, which is 3 parts. The first is cognitive, the training data sets, which are really the basis of all AI development, because it's training data sets that we teach technologies to do whatever intelligent function we want it to do, draw on our histories of race and racism. And the reason that they draw on our histories of race and racism is one of the most widely used building blocks for a training data set is either a zip code in the US, because it's tracked to the census, or a postcode here in the UK. Again, these both donate where you live. And because they're both tracked to census data, they're also tracked to group level assumptions about education levels, which are impacted by education policy. As I said earlier, group level assumptions about health data, group level assumptions around criminality, which are all racialized because of policy making. We also identified, as we were speaking to the folks for our study, that there is an emotional component to literacy. So as you learn, one of the things that we found as a research team was that we had to get over discomfort about talking about race and racism. Even the very idea that the AI could have racialized harms, sometimes we found we're shutting down our conversations because people were not aware, cognitive of, accepting of these ideas of structural racism. So as we were going through our process, and even as we were introducing the bill that I discussed on the last slide, we had to think about ways of how do we pull people into the discussion around AI rights and race without triggering these other really unhelpful feelings of helplessness and feelings of not being able to confront the subject matter. So that's something that definitely had to be overcome. And then the third was an action plan. So once you know that AI systems are capable of racialized harms, and you know that there has to be quite a delicate strategic approach, specifically when we're not speaking to the choir. I feel like many people on this roundtable are probably my people, so I may not need to lean too much into the emotional component, but the majority of people that AI for the People work with are people who do not want to know this information, who are hostile to this information, and who want to shut down. We needed to create an action plan. And what that action plan for us as an organization is that we needed to develop national approaches. So in our case, the approaches where we could discuss race and technology within an environment where discussions of race are being outlawed in some of the states in the country in which I live, as well as global standards. So AI for the People has a UN a UN influence policy. The reason that we go to the UN is that as we are in discussions with our UN partners, our goal is to create pressure on our own government to act as a member state that is looking to be proactive on this issue and act. But all of the standards, whether we're looking on the national, whether we're looking on the global front, have to center the preservation of human and civil rights. And we are specifically interested in the preservation of civil and human rights of Black people, because anti-Black racism shows up very uniquely when we start to talk about human rights, and therefore has to have very unique approaches. So in the interest of time and in the interest of being on Zoom, I'm going to leave you with both those case studies and invite Julia to come forward, but as well as the audience to really think about, when we're thinking about harms for AI, these are harms for all of us. And therefore, racialized harm in AI should be a problem that is for all of us, and that should be certainly solved with the support that Black-led organizations need to solve this should come from all of us. So Julia, over to you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing and for your presentation. I'm going to round this off with a presentation talking specifically about the landscape on non-criminal redress. Can everyone see my screen? Great. Okay. So for context, which I think some of you will be familiar with, this roundtable is the second in a series where we did our previous roundtable almost 2 months ago now, focusing specifically on deepfakes, so on synthetically created images that are used to abuse particularly women, creating, for example, like false naked or sexualized images. And that conversation and the briefing that came out of it, you can see on our website here. I've shared a link. But one of the things that came up in that discussion repeatedly is that the majority of legislation on deepfakes, where it does exist, as well as online abuse more broadly, is focused on deploying primarily criminal law. So, for example, the UK's online safety bill, which is coming, just currently in discussion in the UK, introduces a variety of new criminal offenses for online abuse, like sharing pornographic deepfakes, which again use machine learning algorithms to create these synthetic images, for encouraging people to self-harm, for taking and sharing down-blousing images, and for cyber flashing, which is sending unsolicited sexual images. I'm not going to go into at length here the kind of limitations and critiques of criminal law and criminalization. I'm assuming people in the room are probably familiar with it. But at a very high level, these are punitive. They often create harm in response to harm and assume that will be preventative without that being necessarily backed up by a lot of empirical evidence. And lastly, and very importantly, these kinds of approaches disproportionately penalized marginalized and racialized people, particularly Black people. So as Glitch is a non-carceral organization, we're very interested in exploring what non-criminal responses to different forms of online abuse and different forms of AI harm might look like. In terms of what that actually means, non-criminal redress can include civil litigation, so court cases outside of criminal law. In the context of online harms, technical harms, it's often administered by the platforms themselves. So for example, through platform moderation. And as some researchers have pointed out, including there's a briefing from the Brookings Institute that we'll send out, platform responses can themselves be carceral or anti-carceral or restorative. For example, people have argued that things like blocking people off of platforms kind of pushes them off of the platform rather than engaging them in education, which would be a more transformative approach. And then there's restorative justice approaches outside of companies. So I know we're joined today by a couple of practitioners in restorative justice. I think that'll make for an interesting conversation. But this is, yes, like a very broad landscape of what potentially non-criminal redress could look like. But today we're going to focus particularly on restorative justice approaches. And then in terms of who's involved, a non-criminal redress could be between a victim and a perpetrator. So for example, in the case of deepfakes that we discussed in the last roundtable, if somebody has been directly harmed by another person, that could be between them. But non-criminal redress can also be broader. So it could be by a victim against the platform. So for example, there's been cases of victims joining together in lawsuits against pornography platforms that host non-consensual content. Or it could be a victim against an institution. So recently, there was a court case in France this year where a local court caused the French local government to pay fines for parents whose children had suffered bronchitis and other lung disease due to very high levels of pollution. This could be conceivably, this kind of model could be applied for biased algorithms in healthcare, in policing, as Mitali was discussing, racial biases in the algorithms used to determine mortgages and so forth. And I think this is one of the benefits, or one of the main limitations in my view of criminal law, is that it will very much focus on individuals who are causing harm. And it can close off thinking about kind of institutional or company levels of harm and how people might be entitled to redress from those institutions. So in contrast to kind of that carceral criminal approach, restorative and transformative justice approaches focus on repairing harm rather than punishing offenders. There's a lot of kind of thinking and principles behind them, but in my view, two of the critical ones is that restorative justice approaches are victim-centered. In the context of online abuse, like for example, AI-generated fake content, that can look like focusing on the victim and responding to their needs rather than just simply taking down content, banning content. And also, secondly, they will look at, rather than how you punish offenders, it's how do you invite offenders, persuade offenders to take responsibility and be accountable for repairing harm. Transformative justice is a closely related idea that emphasizes that each incident of harm is an opportunity for the whole community to work together to change the conditions and norms that allowed that harm and to prevent the harm from happening again. So thinking about justice in this kind of broader sense of how do we transform society to make sure, very much with that focus on prevention. So one case study that's potentially interesting in this space is in 2014 in a Canadian university. There was a group of male dentistry students who created a private Facebook group that included sexist, misogynistic, and homophobic abuse, some of which was specifically targeted at some of their female classmates. And when this issue came to light, the university chose to start a restorative justice process that was in person. So this was a case of online abuse where they were responding to it in person, which resulted in the male dentistry students writing a collective apology statement, which was accepted by some of the students that had been targeted. The whole process was not by any means perfect. I think there is some criticism of it, that it was still done in a way that was meant to save face for the university more so than to respond to the victim's needs. But I think it's an interesting case study for thinking about online abuse and transformative and restorative justice. That being said, there's also a lot of challenges for restorative justice approaches to any online abuse, I think particularly with AI, which I'll get into in a second. So I think restorative justice can be seen to work best when you have a small community where people have close relationships and when people really care about their reputation. So scaling it to very large online communities where a lot of people are anonymous has its challenges, but isn't necessarily impossible, because very large online platforms still have reputation systems. But what it certainly would be is very resource intensive, because the primary tool in restorative justice is like having communication, and platforms have so far consistently put profits over people in deploying new technologies, and would probably be, it would probably be a difficult case to make to platforms to invest very heavily in restorative justice. But I think there's a strong argument that that would lead to much better outcomes for people who have been abused, and for sort of transforming the conditions so that more abuse doesn't keep happening. With kind of AI systems, I think there's additional levels of challenge in terms of allocating responsibility when you have that distributed between a platform that might be hosting content generated by AI, developers who created an algorithm, different sets of actors who put together the data on which that algorithm is trained. So figuring out what specifically are the actors that are responsible to participate in that redress process is definitely another challenge. But yeah, that was a very brief overview of what the landscape might look like. I think we have slightly passed over our time, but maybe we have time for 1 or 2 questions before we go into the breakout room, or open also to comments on any of the presentations.
I'll dive in if that's. I think there's different levels of restorative, the way in which we can work restoratively and transformatively. So I'm Lucy Jaffe from Why Me, and what the first thing I was thinking about was the sort of power, like setting the scene, who's involved with creating and building systems, and that you can use restorative approaches in order to include people in that conversation, give people equal voice, and start to build the foundations in a way that is restorative. And then the second thing was presence. So kind of, who's present? Do we see people? You know, where are people digitally literate? Are racialized communities like given the same options as white communities, and therefore their access and all those kind of concerns around privacy and data protection and being in safe spaces? You know, we need people to be, you know, Black people to be digitally literate. And then the third part is the kind of practical RJ, pushing the RJ button, which is more what Julia was talking about, which is this kind of idea about how do you get redress, like in a way that's safe and that doesn't do further harm. So that's one of the kind of base mantras of restorative justice, is like, do no further harm. And, you know, I mean, one of the examples I would give is within the upcoming AI, there's an AI bit, is it, I can't remember what it's called, but AI Act in Europe, to have within that, you know, restorative justice inbuilt into a kind of redress system, but which is also centered around human rights. So you kind of really have that framework, human rights framework, and within a human rights restorative justice framework, and everyone knows how to push the restorative button. So pull down restorative redress, whether that's within an institution or an individual. So that's those were my I was stimulated by the 3 speakers. I think there's a lot of potential actually for AI to do a lot of good. It's just how to harness that and to give equitable access.
Yeah, thank you, Lucy. I think though, yeah, those are definitely the questions. And I think a lot of, yeah, absolutely. I think in the EU AI Act, there is provisions built in for redress. I think to what extent you would call those like fully restorative, or to what extent they follow those principles, is probably up for discussion. But it is something that is in the current provisions of the bill, with a lot of kind of discussion now on what the implementation of that would look like, in terms of, yeah, at the different national levels. I think maybe now we can break out into breakout groups and discuss this on a slightly smaller level, so everyone can contribute. Is that Mark? I think Magda will open up breakout rooms.